They threw him out of the temple, face first, into the mud under the rain. Above his head still pulse two shameful words: Be Taming. And he is smiling, because he knows something no general in this world knows. The doors slam shut behind him. Woo-sik wipes his cracked glasses on the last clean patch of his sleeve and looks around. Stone towers, soldiers on horseback, a sky the color of a bruise. 3 kingdoms drained their treasuries for the summoning ritual. They wanted an S-rank warrior to stop the black tide, the swarm of demon locusts devouring the north. The portal handed them a skinny architect with a skill rated below the lowest possible rank, F-. A drunk under an awning laughs so hard he chokes on his wine. The guild will not even issue a badge below D. Sleep in a ditch, he says, before the guards come back to finish you. But here's what no one in that temple understands. Woo-sik spent every summer of his childhood on a rooftop in Paju watching his grandfather command 60,000 bees. He wrote his master thesis on honeycomb load-bearing structures. He knows that one hive holds 50,000 pairs of hands. He turns south, toward the borderless territories, where the cast-offs go: card sharpening, boot polishing, sheep counting. He walks for hours through rain that does not stop. By nightfall, his shoes fall apart and he ducks into a ruined chapel. A girl is already there, Minju, maybe 15. So thin, her lips are turning blue. Her village threw her out because her skill was talking to sheep. A waste of food, her own father said. She coughs a deep, wet cough and tries to hide it in her sleeve. Woo-sik asks if she has eaten today. She shakes her head. And here is where it gets strange. He stands up, walks out into the dark, and listens. Not with his ears, with something new that buzzes at the base of his skull. He presses his palm to a massive old oak and closes his eyes. There, inside the hollow, a wild hive, 10,000 warm bodies clustered against the cold. He opens the door in his mind that was always locked. He does not give a command. He offers a blueprint. A dome 2 meters across, walls of wax reinforced with leaf fiber, vents at the base, one window facing east, internal temperature 34 degrees. He holds the image steady the way his grandfather offered smoke. The hive stirs. Then it pours out of the tree in a golden river straight through the rain. 10,000 bees land around the sleeping girl and build. Scouts haul bark fiber. Builders secrete wax and shape hexagons. Carriers seal the joints with resin. The dome rises around her like a flower closing for the night. By gray dawn, it is finished. Smooth golden walls humming faintly, warm air rising from the vents. Inside, Minju sleeps in perfect warmth while rain hammers the chapel. Woo-sik reaches through the little window and sets down a bowl the bees filled with honey and a stone they warmed with their wings. Then he drops against the outer wall. His nose is bleeding. Holding 10,000 minds at once costs him something he does not yet understand. But he is smiling. He just built a shelter in one night without touching a single tool. Somewhere north, the black tide eats the world. Somewhere behind him, kings hunt for a hero with a flaming sword. And here, on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, a man everyone called useless just built his first house. It is small, it is made of wax, it will not last a week, but it is warm inside. Minju wakes at dawn. Light touches her face through the little window. She sees golden walls. She sees the honey. She touches the humming wall with her fingertips. Then she looks through the window and sees him asleep in the rain. Soaked, glasses askew, hands caked in dried blood and wax. And she starts to cry. Not from sadness, because no one had ever built anything for her. Minju did not want to leave the dome. She sat inside it, touching the walls and whispering to herself. Woo-sik gave her time. He walked back to the oak tree and sat with the hive for an hour. The bees were tired. Building the dome had cost them energy, and hundreds had died in the cold rain. He could feel each small death like a needle behind his eyes. 312. He counted them without meaning to. The queen was alive and strong, but the colony needed rest and food. He needed to find flowers or resin or something sweet to replenish their stores. Minju finally emerged from the dome. She stood in the chapel doorway and looked at Woo-sik with an expression he could not read. Then she said she was coming with him. He said the road south was dangerous. She said she did not care. He said he had no food and no money and no plan beyond finding more bees. She said she could talk to sheep, and that sheep always knew where grass was, and where grass was, there was usually water and food. He considered this for a moment. Then he nodded. They walked south together. Minju walked 3 steps behind him and would not come closer no matter how many times he slowed down. She kept her hands hidden in her sleeves. She flinched at loud sounds. When a cart passed them on the road, she pressed herself against a tree and did not move until it was gone. Woo-sik pretended not to notice. He talked as they walked. Not about anything important. About the hexagonal geometry of bee cells. About how a honeycomb structure distributes weight more efficiently than any square grid. About how his grandfather used to say that bees were the greatest architects on Earth and humans were just copying their homework. Minju did not respond, but her breathing steadied. By midday, they reached a cluster of abandoned farms. The buildings were empty, roofs caved in, fields overgrown. A wooden sign said the village was called Stonebend. It had been evacuated 3 months ago when refugees from the north stripped it bare. But the fields still had wildflowers, and where there were wildflowers, there were bees. Woo-sik found the second hive in the wall of a collapsed barn. It was smaller than the first, maybe 8,000 workers. The queen was old and sluggish. He sat with the hive for 20 minutes and assessed its condition the way a doctor examines a patient. Then he turned to Minju and asked about sheep. She looked confused. He said he needed animal fat and lanolin and wool fiber. Could her skill find sheep in the area? She stared at him. Then she closed her eyes and made a soft sound in her throat, almost like a hum. After a minute, she opened her eyes and pointed east. A flock of wild sheep had gone feral in the hills beyond the village. 12 ewes and a ram. They walked to the hills and Minju called the sheep down. She did not shout or whistle. She stood at the base of the slope and spoke to them in a voice so gentle, Woo-sik could barely hear it. The sheep came, all 13 of them, walking in a line down the hillside as if they had been waiting for someone to ask. Minju touched the lead ewe on the nose, and the animal pressed its head into her palm. For the first time since Woo-sik had met her, the girl smiled. It was tiny and gone in a second, but it was real. They set up camp in the least damaged farmhouse. Woo-sik spent the afternoon experimenting. He took wax from the second hive and mixed it with different materials: clay from the riverbank, ite from the stone walls, pine resin from the trees at the edge of the field. He heated each mixture over a small fire and tested its hardness when it cooled. The pure wax was too soft. It melted at 62 degrees and cracked under pressure. But when he added pavite and plant resin, the mixture changed. The hexagonal structure held. The material hardened overnight into something denser than fired brick. He scratched it with a nail and it barely marked. He pressed it between 2 stones and it did not crack. Woo-sik stared at the small test block in his hands. His mind was racing. On Earth, he had written his thesis on honeycomb load-bearing structures. He knew the math. A hexagonal cell distributes compressive force along 6 axes simultaneously. The geometry itself is the reinforcement. If the material was strong enough, the structure could bear enormous weight with minimal mass. He had just created that material. Not with magic, with chemistry. He looked up at the ruined farmhouse around him. The walls were crumbling. The roof was gone. But the foundation was solid stone. If he had enough bees and enough of this reinforced wax compound, he could rebuild this house in a single night. Not just this house, the whole village. Minju watched him from the corner, where she sat with 3 sheep pressed against her legs. She asked what he was thinking. He said he was thinking about load distribution and optimal wall thickness. She did not understand. He said he was thinking about building a place where people like them could be warm. She understood that. Over the next 3 days, Woo-sik worked without stopping. He merged the 2 hives under one queen after convincing the older queen to yield through a careful manipulation of pheromone signals. He did not know exactly how he did it. The skill seemed to translate his intentions into chemical language the bees could parse. The merged colony now numbered nearly 60,000. He sent scouts across a 10-kilometer radius to map the terrain. They reported back through dance. He was learning to read the dances now. Each figure-8 pattern encoded distance and direction. Each vibration frequency indicated the type of resource found: flowers, water, clay deposits, resin trees, stone outcroppings. He drew a map on a flat piece of bark using a burned stick. It was rough, but accurate. Minju watched the bees dance and asked how he knew what they were saying. He said his grandfather had taught him. That was only half true. His grandfather had taught him that bees communicate through dance. The skill was teaching him to hear it as language. On the 4th day, a woman stumbled into the village. She was maybe 20 and she was starving. Her dress was torn and her feet were wrapped in bloody rags. She collapsed in the road and Minju ran to her. The woman's name was Yeon-hee. Her skill was thread spinning. She could spin fiber into thread with her bare fingers faster than any wheel. In the old world, this might have made her a textile artisan. In Arion, it earned her an F-rank badge and a life of servitude in a Tirmar sweatshop. She had run away when the owner started selling workers to pay his debts. Woo-sik gave her honey and water. Minju wrapped her feet in clean wool. Yeon-hee cried and asked why they were helping her. Woo-sik said because she was here and she needed help. That night, he rebuilt the farmhouse. He sat in the yard and closed his eyes and fed the hive a blueprint. A single-story structure, 4 rooms, thick walls of reinforced waxstone compound, a sloped roof with drainage channels, windows facing south for light, a central hearth with a chimney that vented through a series of hexagonal ducts. 60,000 bees lifted into the dark and began. Minju sat on the hillside with her sheep and watched. Yeon-hee sat beside her shaking. The bees worked in absolute coordination. Builders laid compound in precise hexagonal layers. Carriers hauled clay and reet from the deposits the scouts had mapped. Specialized workers chewed wood fiber and mixed it into the wax matrix for tensile strength. The walls rose in silence. No hammering, no shouting, just the low hum of 100,000 wings. By dawn, the house stood finished. Golden brown walls gleaming in the first light. A solid roof that shed the morning dew. Inside, it was warm. The hearth was ready for a fire. The floor was smooth, hardened compound, polished by 10,000 tiny feet. 3 rooms for sleeping and 1 large common room. Woo-sik sat on the threshold and bled from his nose for 10 minutes. His head felt like someone had driven a spike through it. The queen's fatigue was his fatigue. Every dead worker was a point of pain behind his eyes. 408 bees had died during the build. Exhaustion, cold exposure. A bird had taken 17 of them in a single pass. He felt each one. But the house stood. And for the first time, Minju walked into a room and said, "This is mine." She said it so quietly, he almost missed it. "This is mine." Yeon-hee chose the room next to hers and immediately began spinning thread from the sheep wool Minju had gathered. Her fingers blurred as fiber twisted into perfect, even thread. She was crying again, but her hands never stopped. Woo-sik sat outside and looked at his map. 1 house, 3 people, 60,000 bees. It was nothing. The second week brought more people. They came in 1s and 2s. A boy of 12 named Taru, whose skill was counting seeds. He could look at any pile of grain and know the exact number instantly. Useless on paper. Woo-sik put him in charge of inventory. A woman in her 40s named Dial, whose skill was softening leather. She had been a tanner's slave for 20 years. Her hands were scarred from acid and her back was bent, but she could turn the stiffest hide into material softer than silk. Woo-sik asked her to process the sheepskin Minju's flock produced. Diel stared at him and said, nobody had ever asked her. They had only ever told her. By the end of the second week, 11 people lived in Hwajeon. Woo-sik had rebuilt 3 more farmhouses and constructed a communal kitchen with a stone oven. The bees had mapped every resource deposit within 15 kilometers. He had located 4 more wild hives in the surrounding hills and begun the slow work of integrating them into his network. Each new hive required a negotiation. He could not simply command a foreign queen. He had to sit with her colony for hours, learning their rhythms, offering blueprints that benefited the hive, trading heat for cooperation. One queen rejected him outright, and her workers stung him 47 times before he retreated. He lay in bed for a day with his arm swollen to twice its size while Minju applied cold compresses and looked at him with worried eyes. He told her it was fine. He told her some queens needed more convincing. By the 3rd week, he had 4 hives under his coordination, nearly 200,000 bees. The compound formula had improved. Yun-hee had suggested adding her thread as fiber reinforcement within the wax matrix. The result was remarkable. Tensile strength nearly doubled. Walls that had cracked under lateral force now flexed slightly and held. Woo-sik tested a panel by standing on it, then jumping on it, then dropping a stone on it from the roof. The panel held every time. He looked at Yun-hee and told her that her skill had just solved his biggest structural problem. She dropped her spindle and covered her mouth with both hands. That night, 20 more refugees arrived at once, a whole family group fleeing the northern advance of the Black Tide. They were gaunt and terrified, 3 children under 10, 2 elders who could barely walk. They had been on the road for 6 weeks and had eaten nothing but bark and rainwater for the last 4 days. Minju guided them in. Dial heated water. Taru counted their belongings and organized a storage system. Woo-sik looked at 20 new faces and calculated in his head. He needed housing for 20 people by morning. He needed food for 31 mouths. He needed the refugees to feel safe enough to sleep. He walked out into the field and stood in the dark. He closed his eyes and spoke to the hives. Not a command, a request. He showed them his blueprint. A long, low building with 12 sleeping cells, shared walls for thermal efficiency, a central corridor for airflow, thick roof with triple-layered insulation, windows facing away from the north wind. He added one detail that was not structural, a small shelf in each sleeping cell at exactly the height where a child could place a toy or a candle. Then he let the hives go. 200,000 bees rose into the night air. The sound was like a river. The refugees stumbled outside and screamed. Minju ran between them, telling them not to be afraid. The bees would not sting them. They were building. One of the children stopped crying and pointed at the swarm. Thousands of golden bodies catching the moonlight as they flew in formation toward the construction site. The child said they looked like stars. By dawn, the dormitory stood complete. 12 cells, warm floors, a shelf in each one. The refugees walked inside and touched the walls the way Minju had touched the dome in the chapel, with their fingertips, as if they could not believe it was real. One of the elders sat down on the smooth floor of his cell and did not move for a long time. Then he looked up at Woo-sik and asked who he was. Woo-sik said he was an architect. The old man asked what an architect was. Woo-sik thought about it and said it was someone who builds houses for people who need them. The old man nodded slowly and said he had never met one before. The next days blurred together. More people came. Word was spreading through the refugee routes that somewhere in the southern Midlands, a man with bees was building shelters. The stories were confused and exaggerated. Some said he was a wizard. Some said he was a demon. Some said he was an S-rank hero in disguise. Nobody believed the truth. That he was an F- with a skill that made people laugh. Woo-sik did not care what they believed. He cared about walls and roofs and drainage and food. The honey production was keeping everyone fed for now, but it would not last. He needed grain. He needed vegetables. He needed a sustainable food supply for a growing population. He asked Minju about the sheep. She said the flock had grown to 30. Wild sheep from the hills were joining on their own. They seemed to sense Minju's presence and came to her, like water flowing downhill. Woo-sik asked if she could guide them to graze specific areas. She said yes. He asked if she could convince them to stay in a fenced pasture. She looked offended and said sheep did not need fences if you talked to them properly. He apologized. She almost smiled. He began designing agricultural plots. The bees could pollinate crops at 10 times the natural rate. If he planted the right flowers between grain rows, the pollination would boost yield dramatically. He did not have seeds yet, but he had a plan. He sent Minju's sheep to graze the overgrown fields. Their droppings would fertilize the soil. When spring came, he would plant. For now, the honey sustained them. Honey in water as a drink. Honey on flatbread baked in the communal oven. Honey mixed with dried herbs as medicine for the coughing children. Honey as currency when a traveling merchant passed through, and Woo-sik traded 3 jars for a bag of salt and a sack of millet. By the end of the 3rd week, Hwajeon had 42 residents, 5 rebuilt farmhouses, 1 dormitory, a communal kitchen, a storage building, a small workshop where Dial processed leather, and Yunhee spun thread, a well that the bees had helped dig by removing soil grain by grain from a spot where scouts had detected groundwater. Woo-sik stood on the hill above the village at sunset and looked down at it. Lamplight in the windows, smoke from the kitchen, the sound of children playing in the yard, a sound he had not heard in any of the abandoned villages he had passed through. He felt the 4 hives pulsing in his mind like 4 slow heartbeats. 212,000 bees alive and working. He had lost 1,409 since arriving in this world. He remembered every one. His nose bled most evenings now. The headaches came in waves. Each building cost him something he could not name. Not energy exactly. Something deeper. As if each blueprint he passed to the hives carved a groove in his brain, and the grooves were getting wider. But the village was growing. People were eating, children were laughing, and tomorrow he would start on the wall. Not a fortress wall, a windbreak. The north wind cut through the valley like a blade, and the dormitory on the north side was losing heat. He needed a curved wall 3 meters high, running along the northern ridge. The bees could build it in 2 nights if the weather held. He walked back down the hill. Minju was waiting for him at the kitchen door with a bowl of millet porridge and honey. She held it out without looking at him. He took it and thanked her. She nodded once and went inside. Woo-sik sat on the step and ate in the dark. Somewhere to the north, the black tide was still advancing. Somewhere behind the mountains, the great kingdoms were still looking for their hero. And here in the Midlands, a man who talked to bees was eating porridge on a doorstep while 42 people slept safely behind walls that should not exist. He finished the porridge and washed the bowl. Then he went to the workshop and began drawing tomorrow's blueprint on a wax tablet. The wall would be beautiful, not because it needed to be, because the people behind it deserved something beautiful. The Inquisitor arrived on a Tuesday. Woo-sik knew it was Tuesday because Taru had started keeping a calendar by scratching marks on a stone near the kitchen. The man rode a white horse and wore silver armor etched with the flame sigil of the Holy Empire of Kadon. His name was Brother Aldrich. He was tall and thin with a face like a hatchet and eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted at the edge of Hwajeon and stood there for a long time looking at the buildings. Woo-sik was on the roof of the new workshop patching a drainage channel when he saw the rider. He climbed down and walked to meet him. Brother Aldrich asked if he was the one they called the Bee Builder. Woo-sik said some people called him that. Aldrich asked by what authority he constructed buildings without the blessing of the goddess. Woo-sik said he did not know he needed one. Aldrich's jaw tightened. He said all construction on the continent of Arion required sanctification by the Church of the Mother Goddess. Unsanctified building was heresy. The punishment was burning. Woo-sik looked at the man's sword and then at the buildings behind him. 42 people were watching from windows and doorways. 3 children pressed their faces against the glass of the dormitory. Minju stood at the kitchen door with her hands hidden in her sleeves. Woo-sik asked Brother Aldrich if he had eaten today. The Inquisitor blinked. Nobody had ever responded to a heresy accusation with that question. Woo-sik said the kitchen had millet porridge and fresh honey and bread that Diel had baked that morning. He said the bread was not great because none of them were professional bakers, but the honey made up for it. He said Aldrich's horse looked tired and there was a trough of clean water by the stable. Aldrich stood very still for a long moment. Then he tied his horse to the post and followed Woo-sik to the kitchen. The Inquisitor ate 3 bowls of porridge. He ate half a loaf of bread with honey. He drank 2 cups of water and sat staring at the table in silence for a long time. Then he asked Woo-sik how the walls were so warm. Woo-sik explained. The hexagonal structure of the wax compound trapped air in microscopic pockets. Each pocket acted as an insulator. The walls breathed, but held heat. In summer, they would stay cool by the same principle. Aldrich touched the wall beside him. He pressed his palm flat against it and held it there. Then he asked about the children. Were they orphans? Woo-sik said some were. Some came with parents. All of them had been on the road too long. Aldrich asked how long this village had existed. Woo-sik said about 3 weeks. The Inquisitor's hand dropped from the wall. He stared at Woo-sik with an expression that was no longer hostile. It was something closer to vertigo. He said that 3 weeks ago, this place had been an abandoned ruin. He had passed through it himself on patrol 2 months prior. There had been nothing here but collapsed roofs and dead fields. Woo-sik nodded. Aldrich said that what Woo-sik had done was impossible. Woo-sik said it was not impossible. It was hexagonal. The Inquisitor did not laugh. He stood up from the table and walked outside. He walked through the village slowly. He looked at every building. He touched every wall. He watched the bees moving in coordinated streams between the structures. He knelt and examined the foundation of the dormitory. He looked at the drainage system that channeled rainwater into a collection basin. He looked at the communal oven where Dale was baking bread. He looked at the workshop where Yeon-hee sat spinning thread while humming a song Woo-sik did not recognize. He came back to Woo-sik and stood in front of him for a long time. Then he asked one question. Are these people safe here? Woo-sik said they were safer here than anywhere else he could put them. Aldrich nodded once. He got on his horse. He rode north without another word. He did not file a report. Woo-sik learned this later from a trader who said the Inquisition had no record of a visit to the southern Midlands that month. Brother Aldrich had eaten his porridge and ridden away and chosen silence. Woo-sik did not know why. He suspected it had something to do with the walls being warm. That same week, the population jumped to 60. New arrivals every day. Each one brought a useless skill and a broken story. A man named Kale, whose skill was folding paper, could create perfect geometric shapes from any flat material. Woo-sik put him to work designing templates for construction panels. A girl of 16 named Suri, whose skill was feeling vibrations, could sense structural stress in any material she touched. Woo-sik nearly cried when he heard this. He had been testing every wall by hand. Suri could walk through a building and tell him in 10 seconds which beam was under too much load. She became his structural inspector. Each useless skill found a purpose. Each person who arrived expecting rejection found a task instead. Woo-sik learned their names, all of them. He learned what they could do and what they feared and what they needed. Then he built for them. Not generic buildings, specific ones. Kale's workspace had a perfectly flat table at exactly his preferred height, with light from 2 directions so his folds cast no shadow. Suri's room had thick walls because she was sensitive to vibrations and noise made her unable to sleep. Minju's workshop had a low, wide door so the sheep could come in and out freely. Each building was a letter. Each room was a sentence. Most of the residents did not notice at first. They just knew they felt comfortable, that things fit, that the handles were at the right height and the light came from the right direction, and the floor was warm where they liked to sit. Yeon-hee noticed first. She came to Woo-sik one evening while he was drawing on his wax tablet and asked why her workshop window faced east. He said because she always started spinning at dawn and she worked better in natural light. She asked how he knew that. He said he watched. She stood there for a while. Then she went back to her workshop and closed the door. Through the window, he could see her sitting at her wheel, not spinning, just sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the light coming through the glass. The construction pace was brutal. Woo-sik slept 4 hours a night. His nosebleeds were daily now. The headaches had become a constant pressure behind his eyes, like the hum of the hives had taken root in his skull. Each building cost more bees. The 4 hives were producing new workers as fast as they could, but the death toll from construction was climbing. Cold nights killed scouts, birds took foragers, rain drowned workers caught in the open. 1,409 dead when he first counted. Now it was 4,217. He knew the number because the queens told him. Each dead bee was a gap in the pattern, and he felt every gap like a missing tooth. After the big dormitory build, he had collapsed in the field and lain there for 6 hours with a fever of 39 degrees. Minju had sat beside him the entire time, pressing cold cloths to his forehead. She did not ask what was wrong. She already understood in her own quiet way that the bees and the builder were the same thing, that his pain was their pain, that every wall had a price. He told nobody else. He woke up and got back to work. The wall along the northern ridge was finished on day 23, 3 meters high, curved to deflect wind, reinforced with stone cores that the bees had packed into the wax matrix. It was the largest structure he had built so far, and it cost him 914 bees and 2 days of fever. But the dormitory stopped losing heat. The children stopped coughing. And on the morning after the wall was finished, Woo-sik walked out to inspect it and found something scratched into its surface near the base. The first real threat came from the south, not from the Black Tide, not from the Inquisition, from other refugees. A group of 30 men armed with farm tools and stolen swords appeared on the road one morning. Their leader was a big man with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his ear to his chin. He called himself Garen. He had been a mine foreman before the mines collapsed and the owners fled north. Now he led a band of displaced workers who had survived by taking from anyone weaker. They stood at the edge of Hwajeon and looked at the buildings and the food stores and the warm light in the windows, and they saw everything they wanted. Garen walked forward and shouted that he was claiming this settlement. He said his men were hungry and armed, and that whoever ran this place had 2 choices: share everything or lose everything. Woo-sik was in the workshop when Taru ran in and told him. He walked outside and saw the 30 men arrayed across the road. He saw their weapons. He saw their faces. Hungry, desperate, angry. Not evil, just broken in a different way than the people inside Hwajeon. He walked toward Garen alone. Minju tried to grab his arm, and he gently removed her hand. She stood in the doorway shaking. Woo-sik stopped 3 meters from Garen and looked up at him. Garen was a head taller and twice as wide. His stolen sword was chipped and stained. Woo-sik asked how long they had been on the road. Garen said 2 months. Woo-sik asked when they last had a real meal. Garen hesitated. Then he said 9 days. Woo-sik nodded. He turned around and walked back toward the kitchen. Over his shoulder, he said the porridge was ready, and there was enough for 30 if they did not mind sharing bowls. Garen stood in the road with his mouth open. His men looked at each other. Nobody moved. Then one of the younger men in the back lowered his weapon and walked forward. Then another. Then 6 more. Garen watched his men walk past him toward the smell of food, and his face went through something complicated. Rage to confusion to something that might have been shame. He stood alone in the road for 2 full minutes. Then he sheathed his sword and followed. The 30 men ate in the communal kitchen. They ate everything. 3 pots of porridge, all the bread, 2 jars of honey. They ate like animals at first, grabbing and snarling, but the kitchen was warm and the bowls kept coming, and slowly the frenzy subsided. By the second hour, they were sitting on the floor, leaning against the warm walls with full stomachs for the first time in over a week. Garen sat in the corner, watching Woo-sik with narrow eyes. He asked what the catch was. Woo-sik said there was no catch. Garen said, "Everyone has a price." Woo-sik said his price was that Garen's men put their weapons in the storage building and did not take them out unless the settlement was attacked from outside. Garen laughed and said that was a stupid demand from a man who had no army. Woo-sik said he did have an army. Garen asked where. Woo-sik clicked his tongue once. The kitchen windows went dark. Every window in the building was suddenly covered by a solid layer of bees. 200,000 of them, arranged in a living curtain across every pane of glass. The hum was deep and steady. Not aggressive, just present. A reminder. Garen's men leaped to their feet. Several grabbed for weapons they had already set down. Garen himself went pale. He stared at the walls of bees and then at Woo-sik. The architect sat calmly at the table with his cracked glasses and his bowl of porridge. Woo-sik clicked his tongue again and the bees dispersed. Sunlight returned to the kitchen. He said the porridge was getting cold. Gadon was quiet for a long time. Then he told his men to put their swords in storage. All of them. The next 3 days were difficult. Gadon's men were not like the refugees who had come before. They were rough and loud and territorial. They picked fights with the residents. One of them shoved Taru against a wall for counting too loudly. Another cornered Yunhee and said something that made her lock herself in her workshop for a day. Woo-sik dealt with each incident directly. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He found the offender and gave them a task. The man who shoved Taru was put on water hauling duty, 16 trips a day from the well to the kitchen. By the third day, his arms were too tired to shove anyone. The man who harassed Yunhee was assigned to digging a new latrine pit, alone, in the rain. When he complained, Woo-sik said the village needed a latrine, and his skill was strong arms, so he was the most qualified person for the job. The man sputtered and said that was not a real skill. Woo-sik said in Hwajeon, every ability was real if it served the community. The man dug the latrine. Then he dug a drainage ditch. Then he helped lay the foundation for a new storehouse. By the end of the week, he was eating dinner with Taru and teaching the boy how to arm wrestle. Garen watched all of this with growing confusion. On the 4th day, he came to Woo-sik and asked what he was doing. Woo-sik asked what he meant. Garen said he had run mining crews for 15 years. He knew how to manage men. You paid them, or you beat them, or you scared them. Those were the 3 tools. Woo-sik was not using any of them, and his people worked harder than any crew Garen had ever seen. Woo-sik said he was not managing anyone. He was building a place where people wanted to be. Garen said that was not how the world worked. Woo-sik said maybe the world needed a renovation. Garen stared at him. Then he said he knew something about construction. 20 years in mines. He knew rock, he knew tunnels, he knew where stone cracked and where it held. Woo-sik asked if he was offering to help. Garen said he was not doing anything else. Woo-sik handed him a wax tablet and asked him to survey the old quarry north of the village. He wanted to know the stone quality and fracture patterns and any existing tunnels worth reinforcing. Garen took the tablet and left. He came back 6 hours later with detailed notes on 3 types of stone and a hand-drawn map of the quarry tunnels. His handwriting was terrible, but his observations were precise. Woo-sik read the notes and said the granite in the upper quarry would make an excellent core material for the taller structures he was planning. Garen asked how tall. Woo-sik said 3 stories to start. Garen said he was insane. 3-story structures from wax. Woo-sik said not from wax, from a composite material with wax as the binding matrix, and granite cores for compression strength, and thread-reinforced panels for tensile loads. He said the hexagonal geometry would distribute vertical force more efficiently than any rectangular design. He said if the foundation was properly set in bedrock, the structure could theoretically go 5 stories. Garen looked at him for a very long time. Then he said he needed to see this. That night, Woo-sik began building the first sot. The name came from Minju, who said it should be called what it was, a honeycomb cell, a place that was small and warm and held together by geometry. The site was the old quarry. Woo-sik had chosen it because the quarry walls provided natural wind protection on three sides, and the granite was right there, no hauling needed. He sat on the quarry floor at sunset and closed his eyes. This blueprint was the most complex he had ever designed. A tower, 3 stories, hexagonal footprint, central spiral staircase, 12 living cells on the upper floors, a communal hall on the ground floor, storage in a basement carved into the bedrock, walls of reinforced composite with granite cores at every load-bearing junction. Each floor connected by the staircase that also functioned as a ventilation shaft, drawing warm air upward. Windows oriented to catch morning light on the east side and afternoon light on the west. Garin had identified a natural spring at the base of the quarry. The basement would include a cistern. Woo-sik held the blueprint steady in his mind and offered it to all 4 hives simultaneously. 212,000 bees rose from 4 locations across the valley. They converged on the quarry like rivers joining a sea. The sound was enormous, a deep thrumming that vibrated in the chest. Garin stood at the quarry rim, looking down. His mouth was open. He did not close it for the next 4 hours. The bees built through the night. Carriers hauled granite chips from the quarry walls. Builders mixed composite and laid it in hexagonal courses. Specialists packed stone cores into the joints. Yunhee's thread was woven into every panel by workers who gripped each strand with their mandibles and pressed it into the wet compound. The tower rose floor by floor, ground level by midnight, second floor by 3 in the morning, third floor by the gray light before dawn. When the sun came up over the quarry rim, the first sot stood complete. 3 stories of golden-brown hexagonal walls rising from the quarry floor. A pointed roof like a honeycomb cell turned on its end. Windows catching the first light. Warm air already rising through the stairwell. 12 cells waiting for 12 people who had nowhere else in the world to call their own. Woo-sik lay on the quarry floor in a pool of his own nosebleed. His temperature was 39.2. His vision was doubled. He had lost 2,106 bees during the build. Cold had taken most of them. The night temperatures had dropped below 5 degrees, and workers caught outside the main cluster had frozen in minutes. He felt each death as a small, sharp point of nothing in the pattern where warmth had been. Minju was kneeling beside him, pressing her sleeve against his nose. Garin was standing over them both, looking at the tower, and then at the bleeding man on the ground, and then at the tower again. He said one sentence. He said, "Tell me what to build next." Woo-sik closed his eyes and smiled through the blood on his face. The first sot was full by that evening. 12 people moved in. They chose their cells by drawing lots that Taru organized. Each cell was warm and quiet and shaped like a hexagonal cocoon. The walls hummed faintly with residual heat from the construction. 89 people lived in Hwajeon by the end of the first month. The first sot was full. The farmhouses were full. Woo-sik was building a second dormitory when Ashley Winterbourne walked into the village carrying a leather satchel and a pipe between her teeth. She was 22, red hair cut short, round glasses smudged with charcoal. She wore a Tirmar engineer's coat with the gild patches torn off, leaving pale squares on the fabric where they had been. She stopped in the middle of the road and stared at the first sot for a long time without moving. Then she dropped her satchel in the dirt and sat down next to it. Woo-sik was on the roof of the dormitory when Taru ran up and said a strange woman was sitting in the road crying. He climbed down and walked over. Ashley was not exactly crying. She was making a sound that was halfway between laughing and choking. Tears ran down her face, but her eyes were wide open, staring at the tower. She looked at Woo-sik when he approached and said one word. "Hexagonal." He said, "Yes." She said the load-bearing geometry was hexagonal. He said, "Yes." She said nobody built hexagonal. She said she had proposed hexagonal residential structures to the Tirmar Guild of Architects 3 years ago, and they had called her unstable. They had said hexagonal design was a novelty with no structural basis. They had stripped her journeyman status and expelled her from the guild. She had spent 2 years wandering the Midlands drawing hexagons in the dirt with a stick. And now she was looking at a 3-story hexagonal tower built from some material she had never seen that was standing in a quarry as if it had always been there. She asked Woo-sik who designed it. He said he did. She asked him to explain the load distribution model. He sat down in the dirt next to her and drew on the ground with his finger. He explained how each hexagonal cell shared walls with 6 neighbors, how compressive force traveled along 6 axes simultaneously, how the granite cores at the junctions acted as anchor points, while the composite panels flexed under lateral loads, how the thread reinforcement prevented shear failure, how the spiral staircase functioned as a central spine distributing vertical loads evenly to the foundation. Ashley listened with her mouth slightly open. Then she pulled out a wax tablet from her satchel and began drawing. Her lines were precise and fast. She sketched the force diagrams he described and added her own calculations in a notation system he did not recognize. When she finished, she looked at the tablet and then at him and said his design had a flaw. The junction points between the 2nd and 3rd floor were carrying asymmetric loads because the staircase offset the center of gravity by 12 degrees. In an earthquake or strong wind, the 3rd floor would torque. Woo-sik stared at her tablet. Then he stared at her. He asked what her skill was. She said, precise angle calculation. She could measure any angle by sight to 1/100th of a degree. The Tirmar Guild had rated it F rank because it was passive. No combat application, no crafting bonus, just angles. Woo-sik said she was a walking theodolite. She asked what a theodolite was. He spent the next hour explaining surveying instruments from Earth, while Ashley took notes so fast her stylus left grooves in the wax. By evening, she had redesigned the junction points of the first SOT and identified 4 other stress concentrations in the existing buildings that Suri had been too young to properly diagnose. She ate dinner in the kitchen without looking up from her tablet. She slept in the workshop on the floor because she said she could not stop drawing. In the morning, she came to Woo-sik and said she wanted to stay. She said she would work for free. She said she would sleep on the floor forever if he would let her build hexagons. Woo-sik said he was not going to let her sleep on the floor. He said he was going to build her a workshop with windows facing east because she seemed like a person who worked best in morning light. Ashley put down her tablet. She took off her glasses and cleaned them very slowly. Then she put them back on and said that nobody had ever noticed what kind of light she preferred. Woo-sik said he noticed things. It was an occupational habit. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her tablet and went back to work. Over the next 2 weeks, Ashley transformed Hwajun's construction process. She was brilliant in a way that made Woo-sik's head spin. She could look at a blueprint and see every angle and every force vector simultaneously. She found problems before they happened. She redesigned the composite formula 3 times, improving compressive strength by 40%. She invented a new panel joint that allowed walls to flex in wind without cracking. She argued with Woo-sik about foundation depths and roof angles and drainage slopes with a ferocity that left him exhausted and exhilarated. They fought over the design of the 2nd tower for 3 straight hours, while Garen sat nearby eating an apple and watching like a man at a sporting match. The fight ended when Ashley proved mathematically that Woo-sik's roof pitch was 2 degrees too shallow for the local rainfall. He conceded. She looked satisfied for approximately 4 seconds before finding another problem. The 2nd tower went up faster than the first. Ashley's redesigned junctions held perfectly. The structure was stronger and lighter. 5 stories, not 3. Garen had said 5 was insane. Ashley had calculated the load paths and declared 5 was conservative. They could go 7 if they deepened the foundations. Woo-sik stood at the base of the completed tower and looked up. 5 stories of golden hexagonal walls rising into the morning sky. Windows catching light. Warm air rising through the central shaft. 30 living cells. A library on the fourth floor because Woo-sik had decided that any real settlement needed books, even if they only had 7 so far. Ashley stood beside him looking up at the same structure. She said it was not perfect. The third floor corridor was 3 centimeters too narrow. The east windows needed recessing to prevent rain intrusion. The library shelves were not level. Woo-sik said it was the most beautiful building he had ever made. Ashley looked at him. Her eyes were very bright behind her glasses. She said it was the most beautiful building she had ever seen. That night, she sat in her new workshop at the east-facing window and watched the moon rise over the quarry. Her tablet was full of drawings, plans for a water system, designs for a bridge, sketches of a 6-story residential tower with a rooftop garden. She had not stopped working since she arrived, and she would not stop for months. But for one moment, she sat still and looked at the light and knew that this was where she was supposed to be. Woo-sik was in the kitchen cleaning bowls when he felt something shift in the hives. All 4 queens stirred at once. The creature did not return for 6 days. In those 6 days, Woo-sik built as if something was chasing him. A 3rd tower, a granary, a 2nd well, an outer wall running along the eastern approach where the road came in. Not a fortress wall, a windbreak with embedded living quarters for a watch rotation. Garen organized the watch from his own men. 12 former miners now stood shifts on the wall, armed with nothing but signal horns and lanterns. If something came, they would sound the alarm, and Woo-sik would decide what to do next. Ashley called it security theater. Woo-sik said theater was better than nothing. The population hit 112. A family of glassblowers arrived from the eastern hills. Their skill was breath of glass. They could shape molten silica with their lungs alone, blowing perfect panes without tools. The guild had rated them D rank and then ignored them because glassblowing had no combat value. Woo-sik put them to work immediately. Windows. Real glass windows for every building in Hwajeon. The family set up a kiln near the quarry using Garen's quartz vein, and within 3 days, the first panes were installed. Clear, smooth glass that caught the light and threw rainbows across the interior walls. Minju stood in her workshop, watching a rainbow move across the floor. She put her hand in its path and held it there. On the 7th day, the creature came back. This time, it did not fly over. It landed. Woo-sik was woken at dawn by every queen in every hive screaming a chemical alarm so loud it felt like a needle through his temple. He was out of bed and running before his eyes were fully open. The thing sat on the roof of the first sot. It was a locust, a demonic locust the size of a warhorse. Its carapace was black and iridescent. Its eyes were compound orbs of dark red that reflected the sunrise in 1,000 tiny fragments. Its mandibles could have severed a man's arm, wings folded along its back like oiled leather. It sat perfectly still on the tower and did not move. The entire village was awake. People pressed against windows. Children cried. Garen's watchmen stood on the wall with their signal horns raised but not blown. They were waiting for Woo-sik. He walked to the base of the first sot and looked up. The creature looked down. 3 stories of empty air between them. Woo-sik's bees were in a frenzy. 200,000 workers orbited the towers in defensive spirals. Their hum was deafening, aggressive, ready. One command from Woo-sik and they would attack. 200,000 stingers against one creature. They might win, they might not. The creature was armored. Those mandibles could crush stone. And if this was a scout from the Black Tide, then attacking it might bring the whole swarm south. Woo-sik told the bees to hold. He felt their confusion, their fear, their desire to protect the hive. He told them again, hold. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He sat down on the ground at the base of the tower. He crossed his legs. He closed his eyes. And he reached out through the skill. Not to his bees, to the creature above. It was like reaching into black water, cold, vast. Nothing like the warm golden network of his hives. The creature's mind was old and layered. Thousands of years of instinct compressed into a brain the size of a walnut. But underneath the instinct there was something else. A pattern. Faded almost to nothing, but still there. like a blueprint drawn in invisible ink on old paper. The creature was not attacking. It was sitting, waiting, as if it had come here to find something and was not sure it had found it yet. Woo-sik offered it a thought, not a command, not a blueprint, just a question, the simplest one he knew in the language of the hive. What do you need? The creature stirred. Its antenna quivered. Then it did something that made Woo-sik's blood go cold. It answered. The response was not words. It was a wave of sensation. Hunger. Not for food, for structure, for pattern, for the thing it had lost so long ago it did not remember what it was, only that it was gone, and that the absence of it was driving the creature and everything like it insane. Woo-sik opened his eyes. The locust was still sitting on the tower, motionless. He stood up slowly. His nose was bleeding. His hands were shaking. He walked back to the kitchen where Ashley and Minju and Garen were waiting. Minju asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. Ashley asked what happened. He sat down at the table and was quiet for a long time. Then he said the Black Tide was not an army. It was not an invasion. It was a hive that had lost its queen. 300 years ago, something had happened to the mother goddess. She had vanished, and her hive had been left without a blueprint, without purpose, without the pattern that told them what to build and where to go and why. They had gone mad. Not evil, mad. The way a colony goes mad when the queen dies and no successor emerges. The workers lay unfertilized eggs. The drones wander. The structure collapses. The hive eats itself. Ashley said that was terrifying. Garen said that was impossible. Minju said nothing. She just looked at Woo-sik with her quiet eyes. Then she asked what he was going to do about it. He said he did not know yet, but he knew one thing. You could not fight a hive that had lost its queen. You could not kill it into submission. You had to give it what it needed. A new queen. A new blueprint. A reason to build instead of devour. Everyone at the table was silent. On the roof of the first sot, the demon locust sat for 3 more hours. Then it spread its wings and flew north without harming anyone. Woo-sik watched it go. He did not tell anyone what he had felt beneath the creature's hunger. The faded pattern. The ghost of a blueprint so vast and so beautiful, it made his own designs look like scratches in dirt. Whatever the mother goddess had been building 300 years ago, it was something that would have remade the continent. And it was still there, buried under madness and mutation, waiting for someone to read it. He went back to his wax tablet and started drawing. Not a building this time, a map. Every report from every refugee who had seen the Black Tide, every sighting, every attack pattern, every direction of advance. He would map the tide the way he mapped a construction site. Find the pattern, find the center, and find whatever was left of the queen. The week after the locust visit brought 100 new refugees in a single wave, a caravan from the north, farmers and craftsmen fleeing the tide's advance into the Midland territories. They arrived starving and terrified, and Woo-sik housed them in 48 hours. 3 new dormitories, a second communal kitchen, and expanded granary. Ashley designed a modular housing unit that could be assembled from prefabricated composite panels, and the bees could erect one in 4 hours instead of a full night. Efficiency was improving. Hwajeon now had 212 residents. The settlement was starting to look like a town. Songa came to Hwajeon in chains. Woo-sik found her in the back of a merchant wagon on a rainy afternoon during the 2nd month. He had gone to the road to trade honey for iron nails with a Tirmar supply caravan. The merchant was a fat man with oiled hair who smiled too much and charged too much. Woo-sik paid his prices without arguing because nails were worth more than pride when you had 200 mouths to shelter. As he loaded the nails onto a handcart, he heard the sound. Not with his ears, through the bees. 3 scouts hovering near the merchant's last wagon sent back a dance pattern he had never encountered. Distress, but not theirs. They were relaying distress from something else. Something that could hear the frequency of insect communication across a distance that should have been impossible. Woo-sik walked to the last wagon and pulled back the canvas cover. A girl sat inside on the bare boards. She was maybe 19, long black hair matted with dirt falling past her waist. thin wrists locked in iron shackles bolted to the wagon floor, white robes stained brown with old blood and road dust. She looked up at him with eyes that were somewhere very far away. The merchant appeared behind Woo-sik, wiping his hands on his vest. He said the girl was not for sale. She was a delivery. The Church of the Mother Goddess had contracted her transport to a monastery in the southern wastes. Special containment. He said it with the casual tone of a man discussing livestock. Woo-sik asked what she had done. The merchant said she heard things, bugs mostly, could hear a fly land on a window 3 buildings away. The church had used her as a listening device for 12 years, some kind of early warning system, but she had started saying strange things, hearing things that were not there. The priests had decided she was corrupted and ordered her locked away where she could not spread her contamination. Woo-sik looked at the girl. She looked at him. Then she tilted her head and said something very softly. She said she could hear his bees, all of them, every wing, every dance, every message passing between every worker in every hive. She said they were beautiful. She said they sounded like a city. Woo-sik asked the merchant how much. The merchant said she was not for sale. Woo-sik asked again. The merchant named a price so absurd it was clearly meant to end the conversation. Woo-sik turned to the handcart of iron nails he had just purchased. He looked at the nails, then at the girl, then at the merchant. He gave back every nail and added 6 jars of honey on top. The merchant's eyebrows rose into his hairline. He looked at the nails. He looked at the honey. He looked at the girl who had caused him nothing but trouble for 3 weeks of travel. He unlocked the shackles and pocketed the key, and was back on his wagon before Woo-sik could change his mind. The caravan left. Woo-sik stood on the road with a girl who had no shoes and marks on her wrists where iron had rubbed the skin raw. He asked her name. She was quiet for a long time, not because she was being difficult, because she genuinely did not know how to answer. Then she said the priests had called her the ear. He said that was not a name. He asked what her mother had called her. She said she did not remember her mother. She said the priests had taken her when she was 7, and she had lived in a stone room with no windows for 12 years, listening to whatever they told her to listen to. She had not been outside in 4 years. She did not know what season it was. Woo-sik took off his jacket and put it around her shoulders. It was too big. She disappeared inside it. He said they would figure out a name later. Right now, they were going home. He said the word without thinking. Home. She looked up at him when he said it. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, like a door opening 1 centimeter. They walked to Hwajeon. Song-ah. That was the name she chose 3 days later. She said she had heard it in a fragment of an old hymn that one of the refugee children was humming. She said it meant something in the old temple language, something about dawn. She asked if it was a real name. Woo-sik said all names were real if you chose them yourself. Song-ah's skill changed everything. Her ability was called Hearing the Buzz, officially rated F rank. In practice, it was the most powerful sensory skill Woo-sik had ever encountered. She could hear insect communication across unlimited distance. Not just his bees, any insect, anywhere. She sat in the room Woo-sik built for her and listened. She heard beetle colonies in the forest 10 kilometers south. She heard moth swarms migrating over the eastern mountains. She heard termites eating a bridge support 40 kilometers north on the main trade road. And she heard the black tide. The sound of it made her go white and still. Millions of demon locusts moving in waves across the northern territories. She could track their position in real time. She could hear their communication. And what she heard terrified her. She told Woo-sik that the tide was not random. It moved in patterns, spiraling patterns, like a hive searching for its queen, expanding outward in concentric rings from a point somewhere deep in the frozen north. Each ring was a search pattern. Each attack on a village or a fortress was not conquest. It was investigation. The tide was looking for something. Woo-sik asked what. Song-ah closed her eyes and listened for a long time. Then she opened them and looked at him. She said it was looking for the sound it had lost, the blueprint, the song. Whatever the mother goddess had used to guide her hive was gone, and the tide was tearing the continent apart trying to find it again. Woo-sik sat with that information for an hour. Then he went to Ashley and showed her his map, the attack patterns, the spiral search rings, the center point in the north. Ashley looked at the map and then at him. She asked what was at the center. He said he did not know yet, but he was going to find out. In the meantime, he built Songa a room at the top of the tallest tower. Quiet, thick walls to dampen vibrations from the settlement below, a single window facing north, a chair and a blanket and nothing else. She sat there for hours every day, listening, mapping the tide's movements in her mind and reporting them to Woo-sik each evening. She spoke in a flat, quiet voice, as if she were reading coordinates from a chart. Latitude, direction, speed, estimated arrival at the next target. Woo-sik wrote everything down. The map grew, the pattern became clearer, and the center of the spiral was moving, slowly, inevitably, south, toward the Midlands, toward Hwajeon. Songa told him this on a quiet evening while rain fell outside her tower window. She said the tide would reach them within a year at its current rate. Woo-sik thanked her and went downstairs. He stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the warm walls and the fire in the hearth and the bowls stacked neatly on the shelf. Minju was feeding sheep in the yard. Ashley was arguing with Garen about quarry logistics. Yeonhee was spinning thread in her workshop by the window. 230 people slept safely tonight because of walls he had built from wax and hope. He had 1 year to make those walls strong enough to stand against the end of the world. He picked up his wax tablet and started drawing. The third month began with a visitor Woo-sik did not expect. A woman on a gray horse approached from the western road wearing a military cloak with the hood pulled low. She rode past Garen's watchman without stopping. She dismounted at the central square and stood looking at the towers with an expression that was difficult to read. She was tall and lean with a soldier's posture and a scar that cut through her left eyebrow. Her eyes moved constantly, cataloging exits and threats and structural weaknesses with the trained reflex of someone who had spent years in rooms where people wanted to kill her. She asked a passing resident where to find the one in charge. The resident pointed to the workshop. She walked in without knocking. Woo-sik was at the drafting table with Ashley. They were redesigning the water system for the third time because the population had doubled and the existing pipes could not handle the flow. Ashley was mid-sentence about pressure differentials when the woman walked in and both of them looked up. The woman looked at Woo-sik for a long moment. Then she said she had come from the imperial capital of Kadon. She said her name was Natalie. She did not give a family name. She said she had heard about Hwajeon and wanted to see it for herself. Woo-sik offered her a chair and a cup of honeyed water. She sat but did not drink. She asked questions. How many people lived here? How the buildings were constructed? Where the food came from? How the defense was organized? Who supplied the materials? Each question was precise and measured. She listened to every answer without expression. After an hour, she stood and said she would like to stay for a few days to observe. Woo-sik said she was welcome. She moved into an empty cell on the second floor of the third tower and did not come out for the rest of the day. Garen came to Woo-sik that evening and said the woman was military. He could tell by the way she moved, the way she checked sight lines, the way she positioned herself with her back to the wall in any room. Woo-sik said he had noticed. Garen asked if he was worried. Woo-sik said he was not sure yet. Natalie spent a week in Hwajeon. She watched everything. She walked the walls at dawn. She examined every building. She sat in the kitchen during meals and listened to conversations without participating. She was polite but distant. Nobody could get her to smile. On the third day, Woo-sik noticed something. Natalie flinched when people lied. Not obviously. A micro-expression, a tightening around the eyes, a slight turn of the head as if the false words had a physical texture that grated against her skin. He saw it when a merchant exaggerated his prices. He saw it when a child lied about stealing extra bread. He saw it when Garen told an embellished story about his mining days. Each time Natalie's face tightened for a fraction of a second and then smoothed. He asked her about it on the fourth day. They were standing on the wall watching the sunset. He said he had noticed that she reacted to dishonesty. She went very still. Then she said her skill was sense of lies. She could hear falsehood in any voice, Every exaggeration, every half-truth, every polite fiction, every white lie told to spare feelings. She heard them all, and they sounded like nails on glass. She said the imperial court of Kairon had used her as a human lie detector since she was 14. She had sat beside the emperor during audiences and negotiations and whispered in his ear when someone was lying. She had been hated by everyone, every courtier, every diplomat, every general, because she knew their secrets and they could not hide from her. She said her real name was Natalie Kairon. She was the emperor's illegitimate daughter. She had been sent to a monastery 2 years ago when the court decided she was more dangerous than useful. She had escaped 6 months ago. She had been traveling alone ever since. Woo-sik leaned on the wall and thought about that. Then he said something that made her grip the stone until her knuckles went white. He said he was glad she was here. She did not respond for a long time. Then she asked him a question she had never asked anyone. She asked if there was anything about him that was not true. Any lie, any performance, any mask. Woo-sik thought about it seriously. He said he sometimes pretended his nosebleeds did not hurt as much as they did. He said he told Minju he slept enough when he did not. He said he told everyone the bees were fine when sometimes they were exhausted and afraid. He said those were his lies. Natalie looked at him with an expression he could not interpret. Then she looked away and stared at the sunset for a very long time. She said his lies were the quietest she had ever heard. She said most people's lies sounded like screaming. His sounded like a man whispering to himself in the dark. She asked what she could do here. What use could a human lie detector be in a construction town? Woo-sik said he needed someone to run the guard. Garen's watchmen were brave but disorganized. They needed a commander. Someone who could read people. Someone who could tell at a glance whether a new arrival was a refugee or a spy. Someone who could negotiate with merchants and know exactly when they were overcharging. Natalie said she had never commanded anything. She had only ever been a tool. Woo-sik said this was Hwajun. Tools did not exist here, only people with skills. She turned and walked back to her tower room and did not come out until the next morning. When she emerged, she had pulled her hair back tight and her jaw was set. She walked to the guard station and told Geden's men they were doing everything wrong. Then she reorganized the entire watch rotation in 2 hours. Geden came to Woo-sik and said the woman was terrifying. Woo-sik said she was exactly what they needed. Natalie threw herself into the work with the intensity of someone who had found a purpose after years of drift. She trained the watchmen. She established patrol routes. She created a system for vetting new arrivals that was thorough without being cruel. She negotiated with the next Tirmar supply caravan and got iron nails at half the previous price because she told the merchant she knew he was lying about his costs, and he went pale and agreed to her terms. She did not smile. She did not relax. But she showed up every morning and she did the work. And slowly, the guard became something real. A small professional force that kept Hwajun safe without making anyone feel watched. One evening, Woo-sik found her on the wall, staring north. He brought her a cup of honeyed water. She took it this time. She said she had been listening to the settlement all week. 300 people now. Conversations in every building. Arguments and jokes and whispered secrets and children's games. She said it was the quietest place she had ever been. He asked what she meant. She said in the imperial court, every sentence had contained at least one lie. Every sentence. For 10 years. The noise of it had nearly driven her mad. In Hwajun, people lied about small things. Stealing extra bread, exaggerating a day's work, telling a child the dark was not scary. But the big things were true. The walls were real. The food was shared. The welcome was genuine. Nobody performed safety. It just existed. She said she had forgotten what that sounded like. He said he was glad the walls were quiet. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. Something in her face shifted, not a smile, something smaller and more fragile. Then she drank her water and went back to her post. The population hit 312 that week. Hwajun was becoming known. Traders carried stories, refugees carried hope. And somewhere in the imperial capital, a report would eventually arrive about an illegitimate princess who had stopped running. The city of Hwajun was named officially at 380 residents on a morning when the autumn air smelled like wood smoke and honey. Woo-sik had not planned a ceremony. Ashley had insisted. She said a settlement of this size needed a charter and a name recorded on something more permanent than a bark map. She had carved Hwajun into a granite slab using Garen's quarry tools and mounted it at the main gate. Woo-sik stood in front of it and said he was not very good at speeches. Then he said, this was a city for people the world had called useless. He said every person here had a skill that someone had laughed at. He said he was one of those people. He said the only thing different about Hwajun was that here they asked what a skill could do instead of what it could not. He said that was the whole idea. Then he said lunch was ready and everyone should eat. It was not a great speech. Minju said it was perfect. The autumn brought two things, cold and Lorelei Silvanari. The cold came first. Temperatures dropped fast in the Midlands once the winds shifted. Woo-sik had prepared for this. The composite walls held heat well. The hexagonal geometry minimized surface area relative to volume, which reduced heat loss. Ashley had designed a heating system using underground channels that circulated warm air from communal fires through the foundations of every building. Garen's miners had dug the channels in 2 weeks, but the cold revealed a problem Woo-sik had been dreading. The bees slowed down. Below 8 degrees, they stopped flying. Below 5, they clustered around their queens and devoted all energy to keeping the hive alive. Construction halted. For the first time since arriving in this world, Woo-sik could not build. He stood in the yard on a frost-covered morning, watching his breath cloud in the air and feeling the hives dim in his mind, like lamps turning low. 4 queens humming softly in the dark. 200,000 workers pressed together, burning calories to stay warm. They would survive the winter, but they would not build. And without building, Hwajun was just a collection of towers with a man who could not do his only trick. Lorelei arrived on the coldest day of the month. She walked out of the western forest alone. No horse, no supplies, no escort. She wore an elven traveling cloak that had been white once and was now gray with road dust. Her ears were pointed. Her eyes were the color of birch leaves. She was 124 years old, and she looked 20, and she was completely lost. She walked into Hwajun's main square and stopped. She was looking at the towers. Specifically, she was looking at the point where the base of the second tower met the root system of an old oak tree. The composite wall had grown around the roots without cutting them. The tree was alive and integrated into the structure. Its roots fed moisture into the foundation, and the wall fed warmth back into the roots, a symbiosis that Woo-sik had designed deliberately because cutting the tree would have weakened the soil beneath the tower. Lorelei touched the wall where it met the bark. Then she touched the tree. Then she sat down on the ground and pressed her palms flat against both surfaces and closed her eyes. Minju found her there 20 minutes later and brought her to the kitchen. Lorelei ate 3 bowls of soup without speaking. Then she asked to speak with whoever had designed the buildings. Woo-sik came from the workshop with composite dust on his glasses. Lorelei looked at him and said his buildings talked to trees. He said that was an interesting way to put it. She said her skill was Song of Trees. She could ask a tree to move a branch or offer its resin or shift its roots. In her clan, this was considered embarrassingly weak. Her sister could reshape mountains. Her cousins could call lightning from the canopy. She could ask a tree for sap and the tree might say yes. Woo-sik's eyes lit up. He asked if she could convince a tree to grow its roots in a specific direction. She said she could ask. Trees were slow, but they listened if you were patient. He asked if she could encourage resin production in specific species. She said yes. Some pines produced resin year-round if you sang to them properly. He asked if she could integrate living root systems into existing foundations to create biological reinforcement that strengthened over time as the roots grew. She stared at him. Nobody had ever asked her that. She said she thought so. He grabbed her hand and pulled her outside into the cold. He showed her every tree near every building. He showed her the root wall integration on the second tower. He showed her the grove east of the settlement where a stand of resin pines could supply the composite formula year-round if they produced enough. He talked without stopping for an hour about biological architecture and symbiotic building systems and the potential for living structures that repaired themselves through root growth and photosynthesis. Lorelei followed him through the cold with her cloak wrapped tight and her expression shifting from confusion to interest to something that looked like wonder. When he finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said her clan had called her weak for 100 years. She said the woodland principality of Sylve valued destruction, the ability to reshape terrain, to weaponize nature. Her skill was too gentle, too slow, too cooperative. She had been offered as a political bride to a lord she had never met, and she had run because she could not bear to spend another century being told that asking was weaker than commanding. Woo-sik said asking was the only way he built anything. His bees did not obey orders. He offered them blueprints, and they chose to build. The trees would be the same, partners, not tools. She looked at him, and something behind her composure cracked for just a moment. Then she reassembled it and said in a very controlled voice that she would stay through the winter if he needed her help with the resin supply. He said he needed more than that. He said he needed a full biological integration plan for every structure in Hwajeon. Trees and buildings growing together. A living city. She could design it. She could sing to every tree in the valley and ask them to join. Lorelei was quiet for a long time. The wind blew and her hair moved, and she looked very young despite her century. Then she said she would need a workspace, somewhere with trees. He said he knew just the place. He built it that same day. The last build before winter shut the bees down completely. A small grove pavilion at the edge of the settlement where 3 old oaks formed a natural canopy. The composite walls grew between the trunks, connecting them into a single structure. Open on one side so the trees could breathe. A desk, a chair, a roof that was half composite and half living branches. He used the last energy of the autumn bees to weave the walls and the trees together so gently that not a single root was cut. Lorelei walked inside and stood in the center of her new workspace. She touched the wall where it met the oak bark. She touched the branch that formed part of the ceiling. She closed her eyes and listened to something only she could hear. Then, very quietly, she began to sing. The trees answered. Woo-sik saw it through his bees, who were settling into their winter clusters nearby. The roots moved, slowly, fractionally, reaching toward the composite walls like fingers reaching for warmth. The branches overhead shifted. Leaves turned toward the sound. The whole grove leaned in as if listening to a story it had been waiting 100 years to hear. Lorelei sang for an hour. When she stopped, her eyes were wet, but her chin was high. She walked out of the grove pavilion and passed Woo-sik without looking at him. Then she stopped. Without turning around, she said this was the first building anyone had ever made for her. Then she kept walking. Winter closed in around Hwajeon like a fist. The bees slept. Construction stopped. But inside the warm walls, 390 people ate and worked and lived. Ashley redesigned water systems by lamplight. Garen reinforced tunnels in the quarry. Natalie drilled the guard. Minju managed the sheep and the food stores. Yeonhee spun thread endlessly building stockpiles for spring construction. And in her grove pavilion, Lorelei sang to the trees, and the trees grew toward Hwajeon in the dark. Woo-sik sat at his desk and drew blueprints for spring. The city he imagined was 10 times what currently existed. 6-story residential hexagons, a central market hall, schools, workshops for every skill, a hospital, a library tower, walls strong enough to hold against an army, and at the center, a great hall shaped like a honeycomb cell, large enough to hold every resident at once, a place where no one sat above anyone else. He drew it all by lamplight while winter howled outside and his bees dreamed their slow, warm dreams in the dark. Spring hit the valley like a door thrown open. The frost retreated overnight, and the first wildflowers broke through the mud along the southern road. Woo-sik felt the hives before he heard them, 4 queens stirring in the dark, 200,000 workers unfolding their wings and vibrating flight muscles that had been still for 3 months. The hum came back into his skull, like a frequency restored after silence. He stood in the yard at dawn, with his eyes closed, and smiled. The bees were awake. Construction resumed the same day. Woo-sik had spent the winter drawing 96 blueprints on wax tablets stacked in his workshop. Ashley had reviewed every one and marked corrections in red chalk. Godon had surveyed every stone deposit within 20 kilometers. Lorelei's trees had grown their roots 6 meters deeper into Hwajeon's foundations over the winter, and the structural readings Surrey reported were extraordinary. The living roots acted as tensile reinforcement better than any thread or fiber. The walls were stronger than when the bees had built them. The first project of spring was the expansion. 6 new residential towers arranged in a hexagonal ring around the original 3, each tower 6 stories tall. Ashley's modular panel system made them faster to build. The bees assembled prefabricated sections and locked them together with fresh composite at the joints. Lorelei sang new trees into each foundation, and the roots began their slow integration immediately. Garen's miners cut granite cores from the quarry, and teams of former refugees hauled them to the construction sites on carts pulled by Minju's sheep. Young-hee's thread stockpile from winter was enormous. Every panel had triple the fiber reinforcement of the originals. The 6 towers went up in 12 days. Hwajeon could now house 1,200 people. They would need every bed. The spring thaw brought a wave of refugees larger than anything before. The black tide had advanced during the winter, while armies froze and supply lines collapsed. 3 northern provinces had fallen. The cities of Helmgard and Brackenwatch were gone, not conquered, erased. The tide left behind glass. Smooth, featureless glass where buildings and fields and forests had been, as if the matter itself had been consumed and the ground fused by the absence. Song-ah reported from her tower room every evening. The spiral was tightening. The tide's search pattern was contracting southward at an accelerating rate. She estimated 7 months before the outer rings reached the Midlands. 7 months before the glass touched Hwajeon. Woo-sik did not panic. He built. He built a wall around Hwajeon. Not a windbreak this time, a real wall. 4 meters high, 1 meter thick. Composite with granite cores every 3 meters and living tree roots woven through the base by Lorelei. Natalie designed the defense layout, guard towers at each corner, signal posts along the approaches, a gate on the south road wide enough for supply wagons. The wall took 3 weeks and cost Woo-sik 11,000 bees and 4 days of fever. Minju sat with him through every fever night. She did not speak. She held cold cloths to his head and kept the sheep away from the workshop door. She was 17 now, taller, quieter. She had grown into the role of supply coordinator so completely that Garen's men called her the quartermaster without irony. She knew every sack of grain and every jar of honey and every bolt of thread in every storehouse. She knew which families had new children and which elders needed softer bedding and which craftsmen were running low on materials. She organized it all with a calm that made Woo-sik wonder sometimes if he was the one holding Hwajeon together or if she was. Population 412 on the first day of the second spring month. 500 by the end of the week, 600 by the third week. They came in waves, families, orphan groups led by the oldest child, wounded soldiers deserting from armies that could not feed them, craftsmen whose guilds had collapsed. Each one brought a story of fire and glass and a sky darkened by wings, and each one walked through the gate of Hwajeon and stopped. They stopped because the city was beautiful. Golden hexagonal towers rising 6 stories against the green hills, glass windows catching sunlight, trees growing through and around the walls with branches forming living canopies over walkways, the sound of bees like a warm hum beneath everything, children playing in the central square, the smell of bread and honey from the kitchens. One woman fell to her knees in the gateway and wept. She said she had not believed the stories. She said she thought it was a lie. Natalie helped her up and led her to processing, where Taru recorded her name and skill and family, and Minju assigned her housing within the hour. The system worked. It worked because every person in Hwajeon had a role, and every role mattered, and nobody was turned away. Woo-sik was at his desk 18 hours a day, drawing, planning, directing the hives, consulting with Ashley on structural problems, and Lorelei on biological integration, and Garen on materials, and Natalie on security. He ate when Minju put food in front of him. He slept when his body forced him. He bled from the nose so regularly that he kept a stack of cloth squares in his pocket and changed them without stopping work. Ashley told him he was going to die if he did not rest. He said he would rest when the wall was finished. She said the wall was finished 2 days ago. He looked at her and blinked. Then he looked at his tablet and realized he had been drawing plans for a water treatment facility for the last 6 hours without remembering when he started. She took the tablet out of his hands and told him to go to bed. He went. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, Bora was sitting on the foot of his bed eating an apple she had stolen from the kitchen. She was 17, short hair, bare feet even in spring mud, a grin that was always slightly too wide. She said she had been assigned to make sure he ate breakfast, and she took her assignment seriously. He asked who had assigned her. She said Minju. He said Minju did not have the authority to assign people to watch him eat. Bora said everyone in Hwajeon had the authority to make sure the architect did not starve himself to death, and she had volunteered first. She threw him an apple and left. The apple had a bite taken out of it already. That was Bora. She had arrived a month ago, a pickpocket from the Tirmar slums, with a skill called light fingers. She could steal anything from anyone, and her hands moved so fast that even Natalie's guards could not track them. She had tried to steal Woo-sik's glasses on her first day. The bees had caught her by the collar and held her 3 feet off the ground until Woo-sik came to investigate. She had been crying and cursing simultaneously. He had set her down and asked if she wanted dinner. She had called him an idiot and eaten 4 bowls of soup. She had stayed, not because she wanted to, because she could not figure out where else to go. She fought with everyone. She stole constantly, small things, buttons, ribbons, coins, not because she needed them, but because her hands would not stop. She slept on rooftops because rooms made her feel trapped. She called Woo-sik names that would make a sailor blush and followed him everywhere like a stray cat pretending not to want attention. Woo-sik made her chief scout and forager. Her skill was perfect for finding rare materials in dangerous places. She could slip into abandoned buildings and strip them of useful hardware without making a sound. She could move through forest at night like she was made of shadow. She brought back iron hinges and copper wire and glass bottles, and once an entire set of medical instruments from a collapsed clinic. Each time she dumped her haul on Woo-sik's desk and waited for his reaction. He thanked her every time. She turned red every time and left quickly. Ashley said the girl was obvious. Woo-sik said he did not know what she meant. Ashley looked at him over her glasses and said, for a man who designed buildings around people's needs, he was remarkably blind about certain things. Woo-sik cleaned his glasses and changed the subject. The army of Kairon arrived on a clear morning in the 4th month. 2,000 knights in silver and flame-red banners stretching along the southern road as far as Songa could hear their horses' hoofbeats. Natalie saw them first from the guard tower. She came to Woo-sik and said one word: Father. She meant the emperor had sent them, not the emperor himself, his general, a man named Sir Aldrin Voss who commanded the 7th Lance and had never lost a battle in 20 years. The army stopped 1 kilometer from the walls and made camp. They did not attack, they did not send a herald, they simply sat there. 2,000 armored soldiers looking at the golden walls of Hwajeon and waiting. Woo-sik climbed the wall and looked at them. Ashley stood beside him with her arms crossed. Garen stood on his other side, cracking his knuckles. Natalie stood behind all 3 with her hand on the pommel of the sword she now carried. She said Voss was testing them, seeing how they reacted, whether they panicked, whether they armed themselves. Woo-sik did not arm himself. He went to the kitchen and told the cooks to prepare enough food for 200. Garen said he was insane. Woo-sik said he had been called that before. He walked out of the gate alone, not toward the army, to a point midway between the camp and the walls. He sat down on the grass and placed a wax tablet on his knee and began to draw. He drew for 2 hours. Servas watched from his command tent through a spyglass. Finally, he mounted his horse and rode out with 10 knights to meet the strange man sitting in the field. Voss was 50 years old, with a face like carved granite and eyes that had seen 10,000 men die. He dismounted and looked down at Woo-sik, who did not stand up. He asked what the architect was drawing. Woo-sik turned the tablet around and showed him. It was a redesign of the army's camp layout. He had been watching their setup through his B-scouts for 2 hours, and the problems were obvious. The field kitchens were positioned downwind from the latrines. The horse pickets were too close to the sleeping tents. The supply wagons blocked the main evacuation route. The command tent was placed at the highest point, which made it the first target for any aerial attacker. Woo-sik said the layout would result in respiratory illness within a week from the kitchen placement alone. He said the horse proximity would ensure nobody slept properly. He said if the Black Tide sent a flying scout, the general would be dead before he could draw his sword. Voss stared at the tablet. Then he stared at Woo-sik. Then he stared at the tablet again. He asked who this man was. Woo-sik said he was an architect. Voss said architects built buildings. Woo-sik said a military camp was a building. It had structure and flow and purpose. It was just temporary. Voss was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if Woo-sik could redesign the camp properly. Woo-sik said he could do it by sundown if the general's men followed the blueprint. He said he would also send food, 200 portions of bread and honey. Because the supply wagons he had observed were nearly empty and the soldiers had not eaten properly in days. Voss's jaw tightened. The supply situation was supposed to be confidential. Woo-sik said bees made excellent scouts. By sundown, the camp was reorganized. Kitchens upwind, horses in a proper corral, command tent low and sheltered, evacuation routes clear. 200 soldiers ate hwajan bread and honey in stunned silence. Voss sat in his reorganized tent and looked at the wax tablet Woo-sik had given him. He had been sent to investigate and potentially seize a heretical settlement built by an F-rank insect tamer. What he had found was a city of 800 people with better infrastructure than most imperial towns, and a leader who had neutralized a 2,000-man army with bread and a floor plan. He did not attack. He did not seize. He sent a messenger to Woo-sik requesting a formal meeting. They met in the field between the camp and the city. 2 chairs, a table, honeyed water, no weapons. Voss said the emperor wanted hwajan brought under imperial authority, taxes, military conscription, acknowledgement of the goddess. Woo-sik said hwajan would trade with the empire, share construction knowledge, provide shelter for refugees, but it would not pay taxes to a throne that had abandoned the Midlands. It would not send its people to die in a war the empire was losing, and it would not kneel to a goddess who had been gone for 300 years. Voss said those were bold words from a man with no army. Woo-sik said he had 800 people who had been thrown away by the world and built a city from nothing. He said that was a different kind of army. Natalie stepped forward then. She lowered her hood. Voss went white. He knew her face. Every officer in Kedon knew the emperor's bastard daughter. Natalie said the emperor could send 10,000 men and hwajan would still stand. Not because it could fight 10,000 men, because destroying it would prove to every refugee on the continent that the empire cared more about control than survival. And there were more refugees than soldiers now. Voss sat with that. Then he stood and said he would deliver their terms to the emperor. He asked one question before he left. He asked Woo-sik how the walls were so warm. Woo-sik said hexagons. Voss nodded as if that explained everything and rode away. The army broke camp the next morning and marched north. Not a single drop of blood spilled. Not a single wall damaged. Bora sat on the roof of the gatehouse watching them go and said that was the most boring invasion she had ever seen. Ashley said boring was the goal. That evening, Woo-sik sat in the kitchen with all of them. Ashley and Garen and Minju and Natalie and Lorelai and Songa and Bora. 7 people around a table eating soup. Yun-hee brought fresh bread. Tadu brought the day's inventory numbers. Sudi reported all structures stable. Diel brought leather satchels she had made for the scouts. Kale brought paper models of the new market hall design. A family. Not by blood, by blueprint. Woo-sik looked around the table and thought about his grandfather's words. A bee does not work for itself. A bee works for the home. He excused himself and went to the workshop. He sat at his desk and unrolled a fresh wax tablet. He began drawing the Great Hall of Hwajeon. The diary was written in Korean. Woo-sik found it in the ruins of the old temple on the ridge above the quarry during the 5th month. He had gone there looking for stone samples, and Bora had come along because she said the ruins probably had useful scrap metal. She was right. She pulled copper fittings and iron brackets from the rubble, while Woo-sik examined the foundation stones. The temple had been dedicated to the mother goddess. The altar was smashed. The statues were headless. 300 years of weather had stripped the walls to stumps. But beneath the altar, Bora found a sealed stone box that her fingers opened in 3 seconds. Inside was a book, leather-bound, pages of thin bark paper. The ink was faded but legible, and the language was Korean. Woo-sik sat on the broken altar and read it, while Bora watched him turn pale. The diary belonged to Han Jong-soo, his grandfather. Not the old man who had kept bees in Paju, the young man who had been the last priest of the mother goddess. 312 years ago, Jong-soo had served in this temple. He had been the keeper of the hive. The mother goddess was real, not a deity in the traditional sense. She was the first queen, a being of immense power whose consciousness spanned every insect colony on the continent. She did not rule, she designed. Her mind was a living blueprint that guided 1 billion creatures in an act of continuous creation. The forests grew where she dreamed them. The rivers flowed where she drew their paths. The very landscape of Aryan was her architecture. Then something broke. Jung-soo's diary described it in fragments. A war among the gods, a betrayal. The goddess was not killed. She was removed, pulled out of the world like a thread pulled from cloth. And without her, the hive lost its blueprint. The 1 billion creatures that had built and maintained the world under her guidance were suddenly purposeless. Most went dormant, some went mad. The worst of them mutated over centuries into what the world now called the Black Tide. Jung-soo had tried to hold the temple together. He had tried to preserve the goddess's last blueprint in the sacred archives. But the other priests had panicked and destroyed the records. They had sealed the temple and declared the goddess dead. Jung-soo had taken the one thing he could save, the knowledge of the hive language, the ability to speak to insects the way the goddess had. He had carried it through a portal to another world, to Earth, to Korea, to a rooftop in Paju, where he had kept bees for decades, waiting for a descendant who could carry the language back. The last entry was dated 41 years ago in Earth time. Jung-soo was old. His handwriting shook. He wrote that his grandson had been born, that the boy had sat in front of the hives at age 3 and the bees had not stung him, that the boy had watched the hexagonal cells with an intensity that was not childlike, but architectural. Jung-soo wrote that the boy would be the one. He wrote that he had prepared the return path. The portal would activate upon his own death. The cost was his life. He had accepted this 30 years ago when he first felt the tide's madness leaking through the barrier between worlds. He wrote one final line. "Grandson, forgive me. I knew what you would face, but you are the only one who can build what she could not finish." Woo-sik sat on the broken altar for a long time. The wind blew through the ruined temple. Bora sat next to him and did not speak. She could not read Korean, but she could read his face. After a while, she put her hand on his arm. She did not say anything. She just left it there. He closed the diary and held it against his chest. His grandfather had not been a simple beekeeper. His car accident had not been an accident. His whole life had been a preparation for this. Every summer with the bees, every book on architecture, every hexagonal drawing he had made as a child that his teachers called strange. All of it leading here, to a broken world that needed a builder. He stood up and put the diary in his bag. He looked north. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the tide was spiraling closer. 1 billion mad creatures searching for a queen who was gone, searching for a blueprint that had been erased. And he was the only person alive who could draw it again. He walked back to Hwajeon in silence. Bora walked beside him, not behind him, beside him. When they reached the gate, she stopped and said she did not understand what was in the book, but she understood that it had hurt him. She said she was not good at saying things that mattered. Then she said she was glad he was here. She said it fast and quiet, and then she was gone over the wall before he could respond. That night, he told them. All 7 of them gathered in his workshop. Ashley, Garen, Minju, Natalie, Lorelai, Song-ah, Bora. He told them about the diary, about his grandfather, about the mother goddess and the true nature of the tide, about what he would have to do. He would have to go north, to the center of the spiral, to whatever remained of the goddess's original hive. And he would have to sing. Not command, not fight, sing the blueprint back into the world. Become the new queen of a hive so vast it spanned a continent. The room was quiet for a long time. Minju spoke first. She asked if he would still be himself afterward. He said he did not know. Song-ah spoke next. She said she had always heard something in his voice when he spoke to the bees, a resonance, a depth. She said it was the same frequency she heard in the oldest fragments of the temple hymns. She said he was already becoming what he needed to be. He just had not finished the transition. Natalie asked how long the journey north would take. He said 3 months minimum, through territory the tide had already consumed. Lorelai asked if the trees could help. She said the old root networks extended deep into the north. She could ask them to clear paths, to mark safe routes. Ashley asked about the logistics, food, shelter, transport. She was already drawing supply calculations on her tablet. Garen asked who would protect the city while he was gone. Bora said nothing. She sat on the windowsill with her knees pulled up and looked at the floor. Then she looked up and said she was coming with him. She said he could not stop her. She said she would follow him anyway and steal his glasses if he tried to leave without her. Everyone argued for an hour. In the end, they all agreed on one thing. He was not going alone. They left Hwajeon on the first day of the 6th month. Woo-sik placed the city in the hands of Garen and Yunhee and Suri and Taru and Dale and Kale and the hundreds of people who had built it together. Garen stood at the gate and shook Woo-sik's hand and said the city would be standing when he came back. He said it with the voice of a man who had once led thieves and now led a community and meant every word. Yunhee gave them spools of reinforced thread. Taru gave them an exact inventory of supplies, counted down to the last dried apple. Suri touched the gate wall and said the structure was sound. Dale gave them leather packs and boots for everyone. Minju's sheep carried the supplies. 12 ewes in a steady line, guided by her voice. The flock had grown to 80 over the winter, and she had selected the 12 strongest for the journey. Each one carried packs loaded with food and thread and composite materials and wax tablets covered in blueprints. Woo-sik brought 2 hives, not all 4. Hwajeon needed the other 2 for defense and maintenance. He carried 106,000 bees north with him. The queens rode in insulated wax chambers strapped to the pack sheep. The workers flew in rotating shifts, scouts ahead, builders on standby, guards flanking the column. Ashley walked beside Woo-sik with her tablet and her pipe and a look of grim determination. She had designed the marching formation, hexagonal of course. Natalie led the guard, 10 trained fighters from Hwajun's militia. She had armed them with composite shields and short spears. Not much against the tide, but better than nothing. Lorelei walked at the rear singing softly to the trees. As they moved north, she reached out through the root networks and the forest responded. Branches shifted to clear the path. Roots surfaced to mark safe ground. Resin flowed from pine trunks into collection vessels the bees carried. The forest itself was guiding them. Songa walked in the center of the column with her eyes closed and her head tilted, listening. The tide was still 300 kilometers north, but she could hear it. The sound of millions of wings, the grinding of mandibles on stone, the keening. That was the word she used. The tide was keening, like an animal in pain. Bora ranged ahead. She moved through the forest like smoke, silent and fast. She scouted the path and reported back with hand signals that Natalie's guards had learned. She found abandoned villages, stripped fields, and the first glass. A clearing in the forest where trees should have been. Instead, there was a smooth plain of fused silica reflecting the sky like a dark mirror. Woo-sik knelt at the edge and touched it. His bees recoiled. The glass was not just absence, it was anti-pattern, the opposite of what the goddess had built. Where she had designed complexity, the tide had imposed blankness. Where she had drawn life, the tide had erased it down to the molecular level. Woo-sik stood up and looked north. This was what would happen to Hwajun, to the Midlands, to the whole continent, unless he reached the center. They traveled for 3 weeks, through increasingly devastated territory. The glass fields grew larger, the forests thinned, the temperature dropped. Woo-sik lost bees every day to the cold. He kept the hives warm with portable shelters that Lorelei's trees helped anchor. But the further north they went, the fewer trees there were to help. Songa guided them around the tide's patrol patterns. She could hear individual swarms and plot their movements in real time. They dodged 3 major swarm fronts and 2 scouting clusters by moving at night through channels in the glass fields. Natalie's guards fought once. A small group of demon locusts found them in a ravine. 20 creatures the size of wolves with mandibles that cut through composite shields like paper. Natalie killed 3 herself. Her guards killed 7. Woo-sik's bees swarmed the rest and drove them into the ravine walls where they shattered their own wings trying to escape the cloud of stingers. 11 dead locusts, 240 dead bees. Woo-sik sat against a rock afterward with blood running from his nose and his hands shaking. Minju wiped his face. She did not say it would be all right. She just wiped his face and handed him water and waited until his hands stopped shaking. At the end of the 3rd week, they reached the center. Songa stopped walking and pointed north. She said it was there, 1 kilometer ahead. The source. The original hive. They came over a rise and saw it. A mountain, but not a natural one. A structure so vast it defied comprehension. Miles across, miles high, built from a material that looked like the composite Woo-sik made, but scaled to impossible proportions. Hexagonal cells the size of cathedrals, walls that rose into the clouds, tunnels that bored into the earth for kilometers. The entire structure was dark, dead. The cells were empty. The tunnels were silent. No warmth, no hum, no life. Around the base, a sea of demon locusts covered the ground like a living carpet. Millions of them, pressed against the walls, climbing the empty cells, searching, always searching, keening their terrible sound, looking for the queen who had lived here 300 years ago. Looking for the blueprint that had made this place alive. Woo-sik stood on the rise and looked at the dead hive of the mother goddess. He understood now. This was the greatest building ever constructed. And it had been abandoned, left without a blueprint, left without a queen. And it had been dying ever since, taking the world with it. He turned to his companions. 6 women and 10 guards standing on a ridge above the end of the world. He said he was going down there. He said he was going to walk into the hive and sing. Songa said the tide would tear him apart before he reached the entrance. He said, maybe. Ashley said the structural integrity of the hive was uncertain. Sections could collapse. He said, probably. Natalie said she would go with him. Lorelei said the trees could not reach this place. There was nothing alive to sing to. Minju said nothing. She just took his hand and held it. Bora said if he died, she was going to steal everything he owned, and she was not joking. He looked at each of them. Then he walked down the slope toward the sea of locusts alone. The locusts did not attack him. He walked into the sea of black bodies and they parted around him like water around a stone. Not because they feared him, because they recognized something. The frequency he carried. The language their queen had spoken 300 years ago. It was in his blood, in his skill, in every blueprint he had ever drawn. They parted, and he walked through them, and the keening changed pitch. Lower, slower, waiting. He reached the entrance of the hive, a hexagonal tunnel 30 meters across. The walls were dark composite, dead, cold. No warmth from worker bodies, no hum of wings. Just silence and the faint echo of his footsteps. He walked in. The tunnel descended. Side passages opened into vast, empty chambers. Cathedral cells where millions of workers had once lived. Nurseries where larvae had grown. Storage halls where food had been kept. All empty. All dark. The architecture was beautiful even in death. Perfect hexagonal geometry at a scale that made his own work look like a child's toy. Woo-sik walked deeper. The darkness was total now. His bees could not follow. The cold was too deep. The 106,000 workers he had brought hovered at the entrance in a golden cloud and waited. He was alone. He walked by touch, his fingers on the walls reading the hexagonal patterns like braille. The geometry spoke to him. Each cell had been placed with purpose. Each wall bore the ghost of a blueprint so complex it would take 1,000 lifetimes to draw on paper. But he did not need paper. He had the language. He reached the center. He knew it by feel. The tunnel opened into a space so large his footsteps echoed for seconds. The Queen's Chamber, a sphere 100 meters across, with hexagonal cells covering every surface. In the center of the floor, a raised platform where the Queen had sat, where she had dreamed the continent into shape, where her mind had touched every insect in the world and given them purpose. The platform was empty. It had been empty for 300 years. Woo-sik climbed onto it and sat down. He crossed his legs. He took off his cracked glasses and set them beside him. He closed his eyes. The darkness pressed against him. The silence was absolute. And then he began to sing. Not words, the language of the hive, clicks and hums and vibrations that came from his chest and his throat and his teeth and his bones. The song his grandfather had planted in him. The song the bees had been teaching him since the first night in the ruined chapel. The song the mother goddess had sung for millennia before she was torn away. The first notes were small. They echoed in the empty chamber and died. But he kept singing. He sang the blueprint of a dome for a girl who was cold. He sang the blueprint of a house for 3 people who had nowhere. He sang the first sot rising in the quarry. He sang the towers of Hwajun, the walls, the windows, the kitchens and workshops and libraries. He sang every building he had ever made, every room designed for a specific person, every shelf at the right height, every window facing the right direction, every wall that was warm because someone needed warmth. He sang Minju's workshop with the low door for sheep. He sang Ashley's east-facing window. He sang Lorelei's grove where the trees leaned in to listen. He sang Songa's quiet tower. He sang Natalie's guard post where the lies were soft. He sang Bora's rooftop where she hid from the tenderness she could not name. He sang every letter he had ever written in architecture. and the hive listened. The walls began to hum, faintly at first, then stronger. The dead composite vibrated with a frequency it had not felt in 3 centuries. The hexagonal cells caught the sound and amplified it the way they were designed to. Each cell passed the song to 6 neighbors, and each of those to 6 more, and the sound cascaded outward through the mountain, through tunnels and chambers and nurseries and halls, through the walls and into the ground, and through the roots that Lorelei had been singing to for months. The roots carried the sound south, through the forest floor, through the glass fields where the dead ground cracked and shattered as something alive pushed through beneath, through the Midlands, all the way to Hwajeon, where Garen stood on the wall at midnight and felt the ground hum beneath his boots and looked north and saw light on the horizon. In the queen's chamber, Woo-sik sang and the song changed. It was no longer his buildings, it was the mother goddess's blueprint, the original design, the one that had shaped the continent. Forests and rivers and mountains and fields, cities of living architecture where every creature had a purpose. A world built not by conquest, but by cooperation, not by command, but by invitation. He could feel it pouring through him like water through a channel. The blueprint was too vast for any human mind. It should have torn him apart. It should have burned away everything that was Han Woo-sik and left only the queen. But it did not. Because Woo-sik had done something the mother goddess never had. He had built for people. Not for a hive, for individuals with names and fears and favorite kinds of light. The goddess's blueprint was perfect, but cold, a machine. Woo-sik wove into it the things she had lacked: warmth, specificity, the knowledge that a building is not a structure. A building is a letter to someone who needs a home. The song changed again. It was not the goddess's song anymore. It was not Woo-sik's song. It was something new, a blueprint that held both: order and warmth, pattern and kindness. The geometry of the hive and the heart of the architect. Outside, the locusts stopped keening. The silence spread outward from the hive like a wave. Millions of creatures frozen in place, listening, remembering. The madness that had driven them for 300 years was a noise, a static. And the song was cutting through it the way morning light cuts through fog. They remembered, not all at once, slowly, one by one, then in clusters, then in waves. They remembered what they were, not destroyers, builders, the goddess's workers, the ones who had shaped the world. The keening stopped. The glass fields stopped spreading. The black tide was still. Woo-sik sang for 3 days. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He did not stop. Songa on the ridge above heard every note and wept because she had never heard anything so beautiful. Ashley calculated the acoustic propagation and could not explain how sound traveled through solid rock for hundreds of kilometers. Natalie stood with her sword drawn, guarding the entrance, and did not move for 72 hours. Lorelei sang with the trees, and the trees sang with the roots, and the roots sang with the ground, and the continent itself became an instrument. Minju sat at the entrance of the hive with her sheep around her and waited. She did not cry. She did not panic. She waited the way she had always waited, with her hands folded and her eyes steady, knowing he would come back because he had promised to build her a house where her fingers would not get cold in winter, and he had not finished it yet. Bora sat on the highest point of the ridge and watched the sky. She said nothing. She held his spare pair of glasses in her hands and turned them over and over. On the 3rd day, the song ended. The hive was alive. Warm light pulsed through the walls. Workers moved in the tunnels. Not demon locusts anymore. Something between insect and light. Creatures of purpose. Building, repairing, following the new blueprint that was both ancient and human. Woo-sik walked out of the hive at dawn. He was thinner. His hair had white streaks that had not been there before. His eyes were different, deeper, as if they were looking at the world and seeing its blueprint at the same time. But he was still Woo-sik. He still had his cracked glasses in his pocket. He still squinted in the sunlight. He still looked at the 6 women waiting for him and said the first thing that came to mind. He said he was hungry and asked if anyone had saved him some bread. Bora threw his spare glasses at his head. He caught them. Minju handed him bread and honey. He ate sitting on the slope while the reformed hive hummed behind him and the sky above was clear for the first time in 3 years. The tide was over. Not because it had been defeated, because it had been given what it needed. A queen, a blueprint, a reason to build. The continent would heal, the glass fields would be reclaimed, life would return to the north. It would take years, decades, but the song was in the ground now, in every root and every stone and every insect on Arian. Building. Always building. They walked south. The journey home took 2 weeks. The land was already changing. Grass pushed through the edges of the glass fields. Trees straightened. Rivers found their channels again. Animals returned to forests that had been silent for years. Songa said the sound of the world was different now. Quieter, steadier, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm after a long illness. They reached Hwajeon on a morning when the sun turned the towers gold. Garen was at the gate. Behind him stood the entire city, 3,000 people who had gathered on the walls and in the square and on the rooftops to watch the road south. When Woo-sik walked through the gate, nobody cheered. The silence was total. 3,000 people looking at the man who had saved the world by singing it a lullaby. Then a child in the front row held up a piece of bread with honey on it, and Woo-sik knelt down and took it and said thank you, and the silence broke. Not into cheering, into something quieter. A hum. A vibration that started in the chest and spread through the crowd. 3,000 people humming together without knowing why. The same frequency, the same song. The hive's song. Hwajeon's song. The sound of a city that had been built by someone who believed that the smallest skill and the smallest person and the smallest bee could hold up the world if you gave them the right blueprint. Woo-sik stood up and looked at his city. Golden towers against a clear sky, glass windows catching light, trees growing through the walls, bees circling overhead in patterns that spelled home in a language only he could read. He adjusted his glasses and turned to the people beside him. Ashley was already drawing on her tablet. Natalie was organizing the guard. Lorelei was singing to the trees. Songa was listening to the wind. Bora was stealing someone's apple. Minju was counting sheep. He picked up his wax tablet and started walking toward the workshop. There was a spring wing to design. He had promised Lorelei a library in her grove. Ashley wanted a proper engineering school. The children needed a bigger playground. Garen wanted a deep mine with proper ventilation. 3,000 people needed a city that grew with them. He had work to do.